Ahoy! Today we're talking about League of Legends Wild Rift's customization. So one thing that I think is often very lackluster in mobile games is the customization settings for the interface and for everything else. And as you can see in this menu right here, that is not the case in Wild Rift at all. So what I can do here, as you can see, is I can move around basically every element on the screen, and I can also do things like changing the size or changing the offset from the sides. Some of that is in other menus, but there's a lot of things that can be done in that regard. That is something that I want to talk about more in the future, but I briefly want to show that at the start here. This is part of the customization, and I think this is huge because honestly, I haven't found a single other phone MOBA that does it on this scale. And now we're going to go in-game and look at the in-game settings, and that's going to be the topic of this video specifically, because there's a lot you can adjust, and I'm going to talk about what I think are the best ways to use this. Okay, let's look at the settings. First, we have in-game chat. You can obviously turn it on and off. Nothing to explain there. Second option here is 60 FPS. This is something that makes the game look smoother, but if your phone isn't the newest, then you might want to avoid it. It does take a little bit more capacity from the phone, so you can just turn it on and off based on your preference. Then you have the scoreboard, and there is the default setting, which is the full screen. So if you tap on it, it looks like this. And alternatively, you have the option to just make it half screen, which I think is enough, and it just shows up on one side. But in either case, you'll have to probably close it. You're probably not going to run around like this very much, so it doesn't really make much of a difference in my opinion. The next setting here is the character inking. If you turn it off, there's no outline on the characters. I personally think it looks a little bit nicer that way, but I like the character inking to have a little bit more of a highlight for the characters, so I prefer that just for visual clarity. Then we have the screen shake, which I honestly haven't noticed all too much. It's only on a select few abilities, so it didn't bother me so far. If it would bother me, then I would turn it off. Now we get to the brightness, which in itself is just the brightness of the map, so nothing really that needs to explain here. I like it bright, so I turn it up. What's more important here is the field of view brightness. So you can adjust the field of view brightness a little bit more specifically, more detailed outside of the game than you can here. Just letting you know, and I think this one is pretty important because what you can see is if you have the brightness very low, it's significantly darker on the other side here. If I was to make it even lower, this is the darkest it can get. You can see that it makes a huge difference if I walk into this area. And if you walk around certain areas here, you can see there's just a little bit of black behind that brush there, so that means I can't see there either. And if I change that up and I just go all the way up, I have basically no clue what area has field of vision or not. It's so bright that you can barely tell the difference between them at all. And I think you should set that relatively low. You don't have to set it all the way to the lowest point, have it like a little bit above it, but you should be able to tell which places of the map you don't have vision of. And if you set it just a little bit too high, then you can't really tell if it's a shadow or not, or like if the field of vision is there or not. And I think that's a very important part of knowledge to have when you're playing, because you want to know if you can see enemies coming from a certain area. And then we get to the next part of the settings that I think allow a little bit more interactivity. So the first one is portrait lock, which you can see here. And if you have portrait lock turned on, we're going to level some abilities here so that we have space. Then you see these little portraits up here that I can click on that will automatically lock me onto the enemy player that I want to target. And these can be moved in the other settings that I showed you before as well. And they will be for all characters that are nearby. So if no enemy is nearby, if you walk away a little bit too far, then you won't see the icon anymore. But then you can lock on them here again. That doesn't mean that you should automatically fire all abilities with a target lock. You can do that. I can just choose to press and it'll fire at the locked target. But if the target is moving, then it might still end up not landing on the target. You can alternatively do target locking by doing this with the attack button and then aiming on the target. But I find that a lot less consistent and a lot harder, especially if you have like a bunch of bots here. You might end up, a bunch of minions, you might end up targeting a minion accidentally or something like here. And I think this button up here makes it so much easier, so much more effective. Just a little quick click before you use an ability. So I would recommend turning that on 100%. Targeting priority is pretty self-explanatory. it'll either target the target that has the lowest health percentage-wise or the lowest health in absolute value, so just a number. I think percentage-wise makes sense most of the time, but absolute health can also make sense, just depending on what you're after, really. I think a lot of people might switch this one over to absolute health. I'm going to leave it on percentage health for now, and if I ever get the experience that frustrates me, then I'll change it. But at the end of the day, if you use portrait lock, it won't matter all that much in the first place. Force attack follow is an interesting one. So basically what this does is it gives you a little bit more of a range when locking onto a target. Doesn't make that much of a difference with the range character here, but essentially what would happen if you walk around and you have a target lock here, is if I'm a bit further from the target, it'll still walk towards the target. So if I'm slightly out of range, it'll still walk towards the target, and it'll even do that when I'm walking in the opposite direction, so it'll quickly turn me back. And yeah, it makes a little bit more of a difference if you're playing melee. You'll notice it a little bit more. So if I'm just a little bit further away now, it should still lock onto him. There you go, yeah, it's just a little bit more distance. That'll allow you to lock onto him. Basically the same range as the icon basically shows up, I think. But it's a very minor thing for range characters. I would turn it on. So far I haven't found any downsides to turning it on. It depends a lot on your ping as well, though, I think, and how easy the movement controls are for you, how fluid they are for you. So this is something that is definitely preference. Dash and move direction is something that also depends a lot on your play style. I don't have a dash on this character, but that doesn't really matter. I can show you based on the pictures here. So either dashes will go in the direction that you're moving in, or if you turn it off, they will go in the direction of any target that is marked already. So whichever is better for you is up to you. I like the one dash and move direction because if you're using a dash as an escape, then that one is more reliable, and I'd rather have a reliable escape than a dash that's a little bit easier to land on an enemy, since usually when you're engaging, you'll be the one who has enough time to aim at whatever you're trying to fight, while when you're running away, you just want to be as quick as possible and just dash away. And if you're just going in one direction, the dash goes in the same direction. That should be useful most of the time. Now, when it comes to the move stick type, we have the default, and now you have to look at the move stick here. It moves around basically, but only once. When I start out a tap, then it'll move in that place. And if you set it to the next mode, then it'll follow around, which means it'll always move wherever I'm moving on the screen. Whereas the last mode is the static mode. We're here at the locked mode, where it'll stay in place at all times, no matter where you move. I find that if you place the movement pad a little bit higher, depending on how long your thumb is basically, you won't really need the other options where it moves around, and you'll have a more reliable experience because every movement will always be in the same place on the screen. So you can develop muscle memory a little bit better by having it locked. I would just place it a little bit further out up here so that you can move ideally, but that's again a setting that you have to do outside of the game. Lock button centers, as you can see here, is pretty easy to explain. If you click on an ability, then the center will be wherever your finger was, or it'll be locked in the center of the ability icon. I think this feels better if you have it turned off. If you turn it on, you can see it's exactly centered, exactly where the center of the ability is for the purpose of aiming. But generally, to me, it makes sense to start from the middle. Maybe it makes sense if you want to flick an ability really quickly because you can kind of tap above it already and then you're already somewhat aiming in the direction. But I find that to not be reliable enough compared to a quick flick. So for me personally, this is one that I would turn off. As you can see now, it can look slightly different because the targeting area can be slightly off center, which to me feels a lot better. The action cancel method allows you to cancel your abilities in different ways. The default way is if I want to do an ability and then I choose not to do it, I drag up here to this X and that'll be canceled. This X can also be moved outside of the game. You can place that wherever you want, so I could put it like down here or somewhere else as well. So that's no problem. On the other hand, the alternative option would then make it so that there is no X, but if I drag too far out, the ability will be canceled by itself because you just went out of the range of where the ability activates. And you can drag back in. It's not automatically canceled immediately, so you can choose to still use it. I think this is a feature that you can most certainly turn on if you prefer it. I didn't feel the need so far, and I feel that the experience is quite reliable if you know where to flick to cancel every time. And you can't overshoot this way, so I would still be aiming no matter how far away I am. And also I like aiming at a longer distance sometimes because it gives you a more precise aim. So I would prefer the cancel button, but I could also totally see this version being preferable by some. The button layouts, again, you adjust outside of the game. That is for another time, but I'll change literally the layout of everything that you've adjusted so it can look completely different afterwards, which allows for a lot of cool things. The button aim sensitivity allows you to adjust how much you have to drag around to aim somewhere. Aim panning will simply move your camera when an ability has such a long range that it goes off screen. I think we can show that with the ultimate here. Yeah, we can show that a little bit, how the camera moves away from the character just to show you how far the aim can go, even though it can often go a little bit further than that. I personally like it. It doesn't distract me and it helps me aim a little bit better. But for some people, this may be very distracting. On some abilities, it's not as useful as it would seem, especially on Ashy's ultimate. I think it's only really useful when the target is in that exact vision range back there. You will otherwise not see them. So yeah, again, preference. Camera pan sensitivity is for how quickly this happens. So depending on how high it's set, the movement across the battlefield is much quicker if you want to move your camera around. If we put it to minimum, it looks more like this, and it takes us a lot longer to actually move the camera, any significant difference. But then again, you can always use the minimap to do the same thing anyways. The ability minicam is demonstrated right here. It shows you certain things outside of your normal vision, which I would say makes sense to activate for the abilities that use it. Death and spectate panning only affects what the camera movement is when you're dead. Doesn't really matter for anything. You can leave that how it is or swap it, whichever you prefer. The SemiLock Camera is an interesting one. So this gives you a secondary way to utilize the camera. You can see that now that I turned on, there's a little icon up here. And this allows you to see things outside of your field of vision and to leave the camera locked there. So normally, if I move my camera anywhere up here, it'll come back to my character once I let go. The SemiLock camera doesn't do that. If I lock it up here, it'll stay locked and I can see the battlefield slightly different from before. If I don't want this vision anymore, I can free myself by just tapping it once and it'll reset. I think this is a neat feature to have. I don't think most people are going to use it that much, but there's nothing wrong with having it either. So if you want to have it on your screen, you can always put it somewhere in an area where it's not seen or used that much. So you can sometimes, maybe if you anticipate a gank, you can keep your camera out for a bit and use it that way. And then just return to it once that has happened or has not happened. Minimap autopathing is something that I would turn on. It's something that can lead to mistakes if you're not careful, but it should generally be fine. So what it means is if I tap somewhere on the screen, on the minimap, it'll make my character walk to that place, which is especially nice if you're coming back from base. If I want to move the camera around, I have to hold it down. If I tap, then I'll walk somewhere. And this is turned off by default, so you might want to turn that on. You just have to watch out not to tap on the screen if you just want to see a place very quick, because then you're going to start walking there. You can always interrupt the walking by just taking a step in the other direction though, so it's not a big problem. Warding aim assist is also something I would recommend turning on. It does exactly what the name says. If you're aiming towards a brush, then the ward will try and lock somewhere in the brush. So it'll typically try and stay in this area and then have a little bit of resistance towards moving out of the brush. So you can see it snapping back there a little bit, because that way you get the most vision, and that's what we want. The level up suggestions show you which ability they recommend leveling next. But if you look at this, this is with them turned on. And now I'll show you the difference with them turned off. Keep your eye on the icon above the ultimate, about the last ability. I'm going to turn it off now. And you'll see it gets a tiny bit smaller and loses a tiny bit of glow. Just ever so slightly. It's up here. It's such a small difference that I would just leave it on, and then you can just ignore it if you don't want to use it. It's really not a big deal at all. Automatic level up is something you can turn on as a beginner. The secondary option is quite nice, which is a 10-second delay until automatic level up happens. So if you level up and you level an ability right away, it won't happen. But if you forget to level up or forget to level your abilities, then after 10 seconds, the game will do it for you. I think that's a nice middle ground that I wish more games had, to be honest, in case you're ever not paying attention to that part. At the same time, if the leveling order is not something you prefer, then obviously you want to leave that off. I don't think it's much of a hassle to level the abilities yourself anyways. The ping magnifier is pretty interesting, so that's the fixed version. If I ping anywhere on the map, there's this top left indicator showing me what exactly is going on in that place. Or the alternative is, I go for a follows your finger version, in which case the magnifier will be right next to my finger and show me what's going on in that part of the map. Also, purely preference. I feel like this almost feels a little bit better because like you kind of have more of a clear idea where exactly you're pointing at, because you have that little pointer at the end. But again, more of a minor change that doesn't really do all too much. Then you have the audio settings. You can obviously adjust, for example, the music a little bit so that you will hear effects better, which is usually more important. And then outside of this, you also have some additional settings. However, as you can see, all these additional settings are just out of the game settings, like chat filters and stuff like that, or they affect the graphics, which you obviously want to adjust to whatever your phone is capable of. And they don't really affect in-game stuff so much, with the exception here of the screen edge offset, which affects the left side of the screen only. The right side is if you go into the controls menu and then customize button layout. I don't know where they split that between the two. So those you want to use. And again, here you can adjust the fog of war brightness a little bit more detailed, a little bit more percentage wise, I think. So I can go down to 6% or something here, which is not possible with the same accuracy in game. You can see that most of the settings can also be done outside of the game here, so you don't have to go into the game to do all that, but you can always switch them around mid-game if you want to. What you cannot do mid-game is the full button layout customization, which I showed you in the beginning, which will basically change everything at once a lot, so those ones we'll look at another time. If you want to see that video, feel free to stop button and ring the bell. We'll talk about that in the future. Other than that, I hope this was interesting, insightful, and gave you a better idea on how to use these things. And with that, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope to see you for the next one soon. ZiSotto, out.